On March 14, 2025, at 3:47 a.m., Russian Colonel Dmitry Volkov received orders that would seal his fate and expose the fundamental rot in Putin's military command structure. His mechanized battalion, 42 T-90M tanks, 18 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, and 62 S-19 Mesta-S self-propelled howitzers, was to punch through Ukrainian defenses near Velika Novosilka in Donetsk Oblast and secure a crucial supply corridor. Intelligence reports showed minimal resistance, scattered infantry, no heavy armor, maybe some obsolete anti-tank systems. Moscow promised air superiority. Moscow promised electronic warfare dominance. Moscow promised victory by nightfall. Volkov never questioned why Ukrainian forces had suddenly withdrawn from fortified positions they'd held for 8 months. He never asked why drone surveillance showed abandoned trenches with equipment still in place, as if defenders had fled in panic. He never wondered why the route forward was so invitingly clear, a perfect corridor through terrain that should have been a defensive nightmare. The Kremlin had declared this offensive would demonstrate Russia's inevitable triumph, and questioning orders meant questioning Putin himself, a career-ending proposition in a military where dissent is treason and skepticism equals sabotage. At 04:12 hours, Volkov's spearhead crossed into the kill zone. What he didn't know, what Russian military intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect, was that Ukrainian forces had spent 6 weeks converting 73 kilometers of approach routes into the most sophisticated combined arms ambush in modern warfare. Every abandoned position was a sensor node. Every clear path was pre-sighted by artillery batteries hidden in defilade positions 8 kilometers back. Every tree line concealed hunter-killer teams with next-generation light anti-tank weapons and Stug-P systems whose guidance computers had already calculated firing solutions for vehicles that hadn't yet arrived. The Ukrainian defenders hadn't retreated. They'd repositioned with surgical deliberation, transforming the entire sector into a three-dimensional chessboard where every square was a death trap. The Ukrainians had studied Volkov's unit for months. They knew his battalion operated with Soviet-era doctrine: advance in column formation, rely on overwhelming firepower, assume air superiority would neutralize threats. They knew Russian forces moved predictably, following the path of least resistance, bunching up at choke points, and maintaining radio discipline so poor that Ukrainian signals intelligence could track every command down to individual vehicle level. They had analyzed 3 months of Russian operations in the sector and identified 27 patterns that never varied, patterns so consistent they might as well have been published in training manuals. Moscow's military, for all its modernization theater and billion-dollar procurement programs, remained trapped in 1980s tactical thinking with 2020s equipment, a catastrophic combination that blended obsolete doctrine with sophisticated hardware operated by commanders who fundamentally misunderstood contemporary warfare. Ukrainian commander Oleksandr Syrsky had designed the trap with surgical precision, drawing on lessons learned from studying Israeli operations in Lebanon, American tactics in Iraq, and Azerbaijan's devastating drone warfare against Armenia. The first layer was psychological: create the appearance of collapse. Russian doctrine assumes retreating enemies are defeated enemies, a cognitive bias so deeply embedded that it overrides contrary evidence. Volkov would see abandoned positions and interpret weakness, not strategy, exactly the conclusion Syrsky wanted him to reach. The second layer was technological: deploy Starlink networked reconnaissance drones at altitudes Russian electronic warfare couldn't reach, providing real-time targeting data to every Ukrainian unit in the sector through encrypted channels that Moscow's signals intelligence apparatus couldn't penetrate. The third layer was geometrical: funnel Russian armor into terrain that limited maneuverability while maximizing Ukrainian firing positions, a three-dimensional chess game where every move had been calculated weeks in advance, where every decision point had been eliminated before Russian forces even received their marching orders. At 04:19 hours, Volkov's lead elements reached phase line Crimson, a slight depression in the terrain that offered defilade from perceived threats ahead. Standard doctrine: pause, reconsolidate, prepare for the final push. 38 Russian vehicles clustered within a 1,200-meter box, exactly as Ukrainian fire control officers had predicted with actuarial precision. Tank commanders buttoned up, reducing visibility to narrow periscope slits. Infantry stayed mounted, assuming speed mattered more than dispersion, a fatal calculation. Volkov transmitted his position to headquarters, confirming the advance was proceeding flawlessly. In Moscow, staff officers updated situation maps with confident arrows showing Russian forces driving deep into Ukrainian territory. The reality on the ground was about to diverge spectacularly from the fantasy cultivated in command bunkers 300 kilometers away. Ukrainian forward observers, concealed in spider holes 2 kilometers out, confirmed target acquisition. Artillery computers calculated firing solutions in 1.4 seconds, a process that would have taken 10 minutes with manual calculations. 3 batteries of L-119 howitzers and 2 batteries of M777s, gifts from Western allies, maintained meticulously, pre-positioned with ammunition stockpiles built up over months, received firing commands through digital networks that synchronized the entire system into a single, devastating instrument. The mathematics of destruction was elegant. Bracket the target box with ranging rounds, then saturate with high-explosive fragmentation shells, delivering 11.5 kilograms of Composition B per impact, each shell fragmenting into thousands of supersonic shrapnel pieces capable of shredding anything not protected by inches of hardened steel. At 0421 hours, the first shells arrived. Russian doctrine calls for immediate dispersion under artillery fire. Textbook responses drilled into officers at academies where theoretical perfection substitutes for practical reality. But dispersion requires space, and Syrskyi had chosen terrain that offered none. To the north, marshy ground impassable to armor, where 60-ton tanks would sink to their hulls. To the south, a tree line concealing anti-tank teams with clear fields of fire across 800 meters of open ground. Forward, suspected minefields that hadn't been cleared, actually fake minefields marked with convincing warning signs, but containing no actual explosives, a psychological barrier more effective than physical obstacles. Backward, the route they'd advanced through, now bracketed by Ukrainian drones marking every vehicle for destruction, creating a gauntlet of pre-targeted killing zones. Volkov's battalion was trapped in a box of their own making, every decision point eliminated before the first shot was fired, every escape route converted into an avenue of annihilation. The artillery barrage lasted 9 minutes, 9 minutes that redefined the operational parameters of the entire sector. 42 shells in the eye. First minute, establishing the bracket with meteorological precision. Then saturation fire. 163 shells impacting within the 1200-meter box, an average of 1 shell every 3.3 seconds. A drumbeat of destruction that turned organized military formation into chaotic scrapyard. T-90M tanks, despite their reactive armor and supposedly advanced protection systems, are vulnerable to top attack munitions. The L-119s fired M982 Excalibur rounds, precision-guided artillery shells that descend at near vertical angles, striking turret roofs where armor is thinnest, typically just 40-50 millimeters compared to 900 millimeters on frontal surfaces. 3 Excalibur rounds cost approximately $258,000. The T-90M they destroyed cost $4.5 million. But more important than the economics was the psychological impact. Russian crews who'd been told their armor was invincible watched tanks explode from seemingly random impacts, fires cooking off ammunition that detonated with force sufficient to hurl 40-ton turrets 30 meters through the air, in what tankers grimly call the jack-in-the-box effect. Volkov ordered dispersion, his voice cracking over tactical radio frequencies that Ukrainian signals intelligence was recording for later analysis. Vehicles broke formation, seeking cover that didn't exist, commanders making split-second decisions that all led toward predetermined killing zones. This was the trap's second trigger, the moment when tactical movement became tactical suicide. Ukrainian anti-tank teams, positioned in tree lines and defilade positions with disciplined patience that Russian reconnaissance had failed to detect, had maintained absolute radio silence and zero electromagnetic emissions for 6 hours. Russian electronic warfare systems, expensive, sophisticated equipment designed to detect enemy transmissions, detected nothing because there was nothing to detect. Then, at 0430 hours, 18 Stugna P missiles launched simultaneously from positions spanning a 2-kilometer arc, creating a converging pattern of destruction that gave targeted vehicles nowhere to maneuver. The Stugna P is Ukraine's domestically produced anti-tank guided missile, 5-kilometer range, tandem warhead capable of penetrating 100 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, laser beam riding guidance that's immune to traditional countermeasures, and a price tag of approximately $20,000. The tanks they killed cost 225 times that amount. Asymmetric warfare reduced to brutal economic mathematics. Russian countermeasures failed comprehensively, revealing the gap between theoretical protection and practical survival. The Stora electro-optical jamming system, designed to defeat older laser guidance systems systems developed in the 1980s is ineffective against beam-riding missiles that use different frequencies and updated targeting algorithms. Reactive armor blocks work once, but tandem warheads defeat them by design. The first charge detonates the reactive armor, the second penetrates the exposed hull milliseconds later, the entire sequence happening faster than human reaction time. Smoke generators obscure visual targeting, but do nothing against laser guidance that tracks through obscurants. In 45 seconds, 13 T-90Ms became coffins, their crews dying instantly from penetrating jets of superheated metal, traveling at velocities exceeding 8,000 meters per second, temperatures sufficient to vaporize steel and human flesh indiscriminately. Volkov transmitted an emergency retreat order at 0433 hours, abandoning any pretense of mission accomplishment in favor of basic survival. Ukrainian signals intelligence intercepted it in real time and transmitted his exact wording to artillery fire control. Russian forces were withdrawing along Route Sunflower, the same corridor they'd advanced through with such confidence 30 minutes earlier. Sersky had anticipated this response with prophetic accuracy. 3 batteries shifted fire, walking a curtain of artillery from front to back along Route Sunflower at precisely the speed of retreating armor, a technique called rolling barrage, perfected during World War I, but updated with 21st century precision. Russian vehicles attempting to escape ran headlong into high explosive shells that turned retreat into massacre, each impact creating overlapping fragmentation patterns that shredded exposed infantry and disabled vehicles with mathematical efficiency. This is where Ukrainian tactical innovation became genuinely revolutionary. Traditional artillery requires forward observers to adjust fire, a time-consuming process involving radio communication, manual calculations, and iterative corrections, typically requiring 3 to 5 minutes from initial spotting to accurate fire. But Ukraine's forces had integrated commercial Starlink terminals with NATO-compatible fire control systems, creating a network where every drone operator, every forward observer, and every artillery battery shared real-time targeting data through encrypted digital channels. A Ukrainian drone operator could identify a target, mark it digitally on a shared tactical map visible to every unit in the network, and artillery computers would calculate firing solutions automatically, the entire process taking less than 15 seconds from target acquisition to shells impacting. Russian forces, accustomed to minutes of warning between detection and attack, had no time to adapt, no opportunity to implement countermeasures, no chance to escape. At 0441 hours, Russian air support finally arrived. 2 Su-25 ground attack aircraft, equipped with unguided rockets and 30mm cannons. Cold War technology, operated by pilots trained in Soviet-era tactics. They'd been delayed by Ukrainian air defense networks, a combination of Western-supplied NASAMS and Soviet-era Buk systems integrated through digital fire control that created overlapping engagement zones Russian pilots couldn't penetrate without catastrophic risk. The Su-25s attempted a high-speed, low-altitude attack run, firing rockets from 4 kilometers out, too far for accuracy against tactical targets, but close enough to avoid most modern air defense systems, or so their mission planners believed. Ukrainian forces had anticipated this response as well, because Russian air support follows patterns as predictable as their ground operations. 2 Stinger teams, positioned specifically to engage low-altitude threats along the most likely approach vectors, launched infrared-guided missiles that the Su-25's countermeasure systems, designed to defeat older technologies from the 1970s and 1980s, couldn't defeat. Modern Stinger missiles use dual-mode seekers and advanced signal processing that distinguishes between aircraft heat signatures and flare decoys. The first Su-25 exploded at 0443 hours, its pilot dying instantly when the warhead detonated directly behind the cockpit. The second, attempting evasive maneuvers with frantic desperation, flew directly into the engagement zone of a Buk battery that had been silent until that moment, preserving operational security by refusing to illuminate targets until absolutely necessary. The Sa-11 missile killed the aircraft at 0444 hours, striking it with kinetic force equivalent to a small car traveling at supersonic velocity. Russian air support, promised as inevitable and mission-critical, lasted 3 minutes and accomplished nothing except adding 2 more aircraft to Ukraine's attrition scoreboard. By 0450 hours, Volkov's battalion had ceased to exist as a fighting force, a military unit destroyed so comprehensively that it would require months to reconstitute, if Moscow even bothered. 31 tanks destroyed, their hulks scattered across terrain that would become a monument to tactical tactical incompetence. 14 infantry fighting vehicles reduced to burning hulks, their ammunition cooking off sporadically for hours afterward. 4 self-propelled howitzers abandoned intact when crews fled on foot, leaving behind functioning artillery pieces that Ukrainian forces would recover and potentially reverse engineer. Approximately 340 Russian soldiers dead, many of them conscripts barely out of basic training. Another 160 wounded, many catastrophically, traumatic amputations, severe burns, shrapnel wounds that would require extensive hospitalization and rehabilitation. Ukrainian losses: 0 killed, 2 wounded by shrapnel from errant counter-battery fire, 1 artillery piece damaged by counter-battery fire that arrived 12 minutes too late to affect the battle's outcome. But the significance extended far beyond 1 destroyed battalion, beyond the tactical victory that would appear as a minor footnote in daily situation reports. This engagement revealed the comprehensive failure of Russian military intelligence, doctrine, and command structure, systemic inadequacies that no amount of equipment modernization could remedy. Moscow's forces had walked into an obvious trap because their reconnaissance was theater designed to confirm preconceived conclusions rather than gather actionable intelligence. Their intelligence analysis was ideology-driven wishful thinking that prioritized narratives pleasing to superiors over objective assessment. Their commanders were selected for loyalty rather than competence, for their willingness to implement orders without question rather than their ability to adapt to battlefield realities. The Russian military's vaunted modernization, the T-90Ms, the Su-57s shown in propaganda videos, the claimed technological parity with NATO, proved hollow when confronted with an adversary that understood how modern warfare actually functions rather than how doctrine manuals claim it should function. Ukrainian forces had demonstrated that 21st century warfare isn't about having the most tanks or the newest fighters or the biggest defense budget. It's about information dominance, controlling the electromagnetic spectrum and the information environment so completely that the enemy operates blind while you see everything. It's about network integration, connecting sensors to shooters through resilient digital networks that process information faster than opponents can react. It's about precision application of violence, using expensive munitions sparingly but devastatingly, rather than relying on mass and volume of fire. A wild $1,500 commercial drone connected to a $500 Starlink terminal provided more battlefield awareness than Russia's entire signals intelligence apparatus in the sector, which consisted of millions of dollars worth of sophisticated equipment operated by analysts trained to detect Soviet-era threats. Precision-guided munitions, even relatively inexpensive ones costing tens of thousands rather than millions, delivered disproportionate effects against expensive platforms designed for conventional warfare scenarios that no longer exist. Most critically, tactical flexibility and initiative at the junior leadership level, Ukrainian squad leaders empowered to make real-time decisions without waiting for orders from distant headquarters, consistently defeated rigid, centralized Russian command structures where nothing happened without orders from above, where initiative was punished and conformity rewarded. The aftermath revealed even more damaging truths that Russian military leadership would desperately attempt to suppress. Russian forces had advanced without adequate reconnaissance, without confirming intelligence reports that should have seemed suspiciously optimistic, without verifying that the route forward was actually clear rather than appearing clear for sinister reasons. They'd maintained radio communications using frequencies and protocols that Ukrainian signals intelligence had been exploiting for months, broadcasting their positions and intentions as clearly as if they'd published their operational plans. Online, they'd bunched up at predictable choke points, creating target-rich environments that artillerists dream about. They'd failed to deploy counter-battery radar that might have detected Ukrainian artillery positions and enabled suppressive fire. They'd relied on air support that arrived too late and accomplished nothing except padding Ukrainian kill tallies. Every single failure was doctrinal, systemic, and predictable to anyone studying Russian operations with objective analytical frameworks rather than ideological preconceptions. Moscow's response was equally revealing and entirely predictable to those familiar with authoritarian military bureaucracies. State media reported a successful tactical withdrawal after accomplishing objectives objectives, fictional objectives invented retroactively to rationalize catastrophic defeat. They claimed Ukrainian forces had suffered heavy losses and were retreating, claims contradicted by every piece of evidence, but repeated until they became official truth. They showed footage of Russian armor advancing confidently through Ukrainian territory, footage from weeks earlier, rebroadcast as if current, a propaganda technique so transparent that even domestic audiences struggled to believe it. They blamed NATO intelligence and Western mercenaries rather than acknowledge systemic incompetence, scapegoating external forces for internal failures. Putin's regime, built on projecting strength and cultivating an image of invincibility, cannot admit weakness, even when that weakness kills its own soldiers by the thousands, even when denial guarantees repeated failures. But the soldiers know. Russian units across the front learned what happened near Velika Novosilka within hours, not from official channels that would have censored the information, but through the encrypted messaging apps that circulate truth faster than propaganda can suppress it. They learned that their commanders send them into battles without proper reconnaissance, without adequate support, without realistic assessment of enemy capabilities, essentially using them as expendable pawns in operational plans, disconnected from battlefield reality. They learned that Ukrainian forces are not the disorganized, collapsing resistance Moscow claims, but a professional, technologically sophisticated military that plans operations with precision Russia cannot match and executes with discipline Russian forces cannot replicate. Morale, already fragile after months of grinding attrition warfare, deteriorated further as soldiers recognized they were being sacrificed to maintain fictions that served political purposes rather than military objectives. Western intelligence services studying the engagement drew broader conclusions with profound implications for global security calculations. Russia's military, despite decades of claimed modernization and billions spent on new equipment paraded annually through Red Square, remains fundamentally incapable of conducting complex combined arms operations against a competent adversary. Their command structure is too rigid, too centralized, too dependent on top-down control to adapt to fluid battlefield situations. Their intelligence apparatus is too politicized, too focused on telling superiors what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Their tactical doctrine is too outdated, too reliant on Soviet-era assumptions about warfare that no longer reflect contemporary realities. Most importantly, the gap between Russia's military capabilities and its geopolitical ambitions creates opportunities for asymmetric defeats that cascade into strategic failures, battlefield losses that undermine political objectives and expose the hollowness of Moscow's claims to great power status. Ukraine's success near Velika Novosilka provides a template that extends beyond this specific conflict, offering lessons applicable to future confrontations worldwide. Small, technologically integrated forces with tactical flexibility can defeat larger, more heavily equipped adversaries trapped in outdated doctrine, a principle that fundamentally challenges assumptions about military power that have dominated strategic thinking since World War II. Commercial technology, drones, satellite internet, smartphones running military software, democratizes capabilities once limited to superpowers with billion-dollar procurement budgets, allowing smaller nations to punch far above their weight class. Precision weapons, even inexpensive ones, deliver effects disproportionate to their cost when integrated into information networks that enable rapid targeting and engagement. The nature of warfare has shifted from industrial-era attrition battles to information-age precision strikes, and militaries that haven't adapted become expensive, vulnerable targets regardless of their numerical strength or equipment sophistication. This matters because the assumptions underlying global security calculations are being rewritten in real time on Ukrainian battlefields that serve as laboratories for future conflict. Russia's nuclear arsenal ensures it remains strategically relevant, capable of deterring existential threats through mutually assured destruction, but its conventional forces have proven hollow when tested against organized opposition. China, watching closely with teams of military analysts studying every engagement, sees what happens when propaganda-driven militaries confront reality, lessons that inform their own modernization programs and strategic calculations about Taiwan. NATO understands that technology integration matters more than force size, that network-centric warfare defeats platform-centric approaches, that information dominance trumps numerical superiority. Smaller nations realize that smart defense investments focused on asymmetric capabilities can deter larger neighbors, that David can still defeat Goliath if David has better information and precision weapons. The post-Cold War era, where military power was assumed to correlate directly with defense budgets and force size, is ending. The future belongs to militaries that understand networks, information, and precision, not necessarily those with the most tanks, the most soldiers, or the biggest procurement budgets. The broader message is uncomfortable for those who believe overwhelming force guarantees victory, for military planners trained to think in terms of divisions and firepower ratios. Putin sent a battalion to demonstrate Russian inevitability, to prove that Moscow's forces could sweep aside Ukrainian resistance through sheer momentum and superior equipment. Ukraine destroyed it in 30 minutes, using tactics that emphasized intelligence, planning, and technological integration over brute force, a repudiation of everything Russian doctrine assumes about warfare. The engagement wasn't close. It wasn't a hard-fought battle where both sides took heavy casualties and victory hung in the balance. It was a systematic dismantling of an obsolete military by one that understands how modern war actually works, a clinical dissection that left no doubt about which side possessed genuine competence. And across Ukraine's front lines, this pattern repeats daily. Russian forces advancing confidently into traps they cannot recognize, dying in kill boxes they cannot escape, while Moscow's propaganda machine claims victories that exist only in state media fantasies, consumed by audiences increasingly skeptical of official narratives. The trap near Velika Novosilka wasn't unique, wasn't exceptional, wasn't the product of lucky circumstances or Ukrainian desperation. It was template warfare, a repeatable process that Ukrainian forces have refined through 2 years of conflict against an adversary that refuses to learn from repeated catastrophic failures. Putin's army keeps walking into variations of the same trap because their system cannot admit the trap exists, cannot question the intelligence claiming easy victory, cannot empower junior officers to recognize and avoid obvious dangers that would be apparent to anyone thinking independently. They are structurally incapable of adaptation, locked into patterns by bureaucratic incentives that punish deviation and reward conformity, regardless of battlefield outcomes. And that incapability costs them battles, equipment, soldiers, and ultimately the war itself. A slow-motion strategic defeat disguised by propaganda, but understood by everyone actually paying attention to operational realities rather than official narratives. The question isn't whether Russia can win. The question is how long Putin's regime can sustain catastrophic losses before reality overwhelms propaganda, before the accumulated weight of battlefield defeats forces acknowledgement that something fundamental is broken in Russian military culture and capabilities. We've now come to the end of the clip. To enjoy more of such eye-opening content, be sure to click on the card showing on the screen.